a 911 dispatcher received a phone call that defied explanation. On the line was a woman's voice, distorted and almost unrecognizable, speaking words that made no sense. She described impossible things. She described things that hadn't happened yet. She spoke in a language that seemed almost alien. The call lasted 42 minutes. The dispatcher recorded every second of it. When law enforcement arrived at the location, they found something that would haunt them for decades. This is the story of the most mysterious 911 call ever made, and the unsolved mystery that followed. The call comes in on March 15, 2003. At approximately 11:47 p.m., the 911 dispatch center in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest received an incoming call. The dispatcher on duty that evening was a woman named Susan Martin, a veteran with 15 years of experience. She had handled thousands of calls. She had heard people in panic, people in pain, people in crisis. She thought she had heard everything. She was wrong. When Susan answered the call, what greeted her was silence. Not an empty line, but an active silence, as if someone was there but wasn't speaking. Susan waited several seconds and then asked, "911, what is your emergency?" The silence continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. Then, a voice emerged. It was a woman's voice, but it sounded wrong. It was distorted, as if being played through a malfunctioning speaker or being electronically altered. The voice was simultaneously high-pitched and deep, as if two voices were speaking in unison and slightly out of sync with each other. Susan described it later as the most unsettling sound I have ever heard. The voice began to speak, but what it said made no sense. The woman said, "The house is empty, but it's full. The windows are closed, but they're open. I am here, but I am not here. You need to come to the place where the trees forget to grow." Susan pressed for more information. She asked, "What is your name? Where are you calling from?" The voice responded, "My name is every name and no name. I'm calling from where the sky touches the ground. Children are sleeping, but they're awake. You need to hurry before the morning forgets the night." Susan's training kicked in. She wasn't sure if this was a prank call, a mentally ill individual in crisis, or something else entirely. She continued to try to get coherent information. She asked for an address, a phone number, anything that would allow her to locate the caller and send help. The voice continued to speak in riddles and paradoxes. The address is written in numbers that don't exist. The phone I am calling from has no wires. I am speaking to you from inside the walls. The walls are inside me. The walls are speaking. For the next 42 minutes, Susan listened to this voice describe increasingly bizarre and impossible scenarios. The caller spoke about seeing things that weren't there, about experiencing sensations that defied physical laws, about being in multiple places simultaneously, about memories of events that hadn't occurred yet, about conversations with people who didn't exist. The voice would switch between the two-part harmony that characterized it at the beginning to a single, almost normal-sounding voice, and then back again. Sometimes the words would be in perfect English. Sometimes they would be in a language that sounded vaguely like English, but wasn't quite. Sometimes the caller would speak backwards, and Susan could hear herself speaking in reverse in the background of the call. During the call, Susan noticed something else that was deeply disturbing. At certain points, the caller seemed to be describing events that were happening at that exact moment. The caller said, "The east wall is shaking. Can you hear it? The floor is becoming water. I can see through the ceiling now. There are shapes in the darkness. They're looking at me. Now they're looking at you through the phone." Whenever the caller described something, Susan could hear corresponding sounds in the background of the caller. Low rumbling, a splashing sound, scratching noises, voices that seemed to be calling from far away. Susan continued to try to engage the caller coherently. She said, "I'm trying to help you. I need you to tell me where you are." The caller responded, "I'm everywhere and nowhere. I'm in the place between the walls. I'm in the space between heartbeats. I'm in the silence between words. But if you must have coordinates, they are written in the language of wind and stone. But you can come to the corner of Blackwood and 7th. But the corner doesn't exist. But it's always been there. You'll know it when you find it." The search for the caller at some point during the call, Susan alerted her supervisor. She also initiated an emergency trace on the incoming line. Phone traces aren't instantaneous like they are in television shows. It takes time to trace a call through the various networks and relay stations. But the trace eventually came back with a location, a residential address in a neighborhood about 2 miles from the dispatch center. The house was located at the corner of Blackwood and 7th Street, exactly as the caller had indicated. Susan kept the caller on the line while police were dispatched to the address. She said, "Help is on the way. An officer is heading to your location right now." The caller said, "They won't find anything. There's nothing to find. But they'll feel it. They'll feel the weight of the empty spaces. They'll understand that some houses are haunted by the absence of people." The line went silent for a moment, and Susan thought the call had been disconnected. But then the voice came back. "I'm going to go now. I'm going to walk into the walls. I'm going to walk into the light. I'm going to walk into the thing that's been waiting for me. Tell the officers that I'm sorry. Tell them they should leave. Tell them that some doors should never be opened." The call ended. The line went dead. Susan immediately called the officers who were heading to the scene and told them what the caller had said. The officers, 2 experienced patrol officers named James Patterson and Robert Chen, arrived at the address approximately 8 minutes after the call had ended. They approached the house cautiously, unsure what they were going to find. What they found was disturbing in its ordinariness. The house was a modest, single-story home built in the 1970s. The front door was locked. The windows were closed. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of disturbance. The house appeared to be dark and empty. The officers called out, identified themselves, and asked if anyone was home. There was no response. James Patterson contacted the dispatcher and asked for information about the registered owner of the property. The house was owned by an elderly woman named Margaret Hollis, age 78. There was no answer at her registered phone number. The officers made the decision to wait for a warrant before entering the house. They set up a perimeter and called for additional units. While they waited, they checked the property. They looked in the windows from outside. They tried the back door. They checked for any signs of emergency or distress. They found nothing unusual. The house seemed completely empty and undisturbed. Approximately 1 hour after arriving on scene, officers received a warrant to enter the house. They used a key from a lockbox that was registered with the police department for emergency access. They opened the front door and entered cautiously. The house was cold. It was completely silent. They called out Margaret Hollis's name. There was no response. They began to clear the house, moving from room to room. What they found was shocking. What the officers found the house was immaculate. Everything was perfectly ordered. The furniture was arranged with precision. The kitchen was spotlessly clean. The bathroom was organized meticulously. There were no dishes in the sink, no clothes on the floor, no signs of normal human habitation. It was as if the house had been staged to look like someone lived there, but no one actually did. Or as if someone had been living there and had cleaned obsessively. But there was something deeply unsettling about the house beyond its excessive cleanliness. The walls of the living room were covered with writing. Not graffiti or defacement, but careful, precise writing that covered every surface. The walls were filled with words, sentences, paragraphs, all written in black marker. The officers read what they could see. Some of it was coherent. Some of it was nonsensical. Some of it was written backwards. Some of it appeared to be in a language other than English. One section read, "They are here, but they're not. I can see them in the corners. They speak without words. They touch without hands. I cannot leave. I cannot stay. I'm becoming the walls. The walls are becoming me." Another section read, "The door to the place between places is inside the refrigerator. I've checked it every day for 3 years. The children came through the door last Tuesday. That last Tuesday was yesterday, and yesterday is tomorrow." And yet another section read, "I am 43 people. I am 0 people. I am the silence in the space between heartbeats. I am the thing that watches from the shadows. I am the echo of someone who never existed. I am, therefore I am not." In the bedroom, the officers found something even more disturbing. The walls were covered with the same writing, but there were also drawings. Intricate, detailed drawings that seemed to be attempts to depict things that didn't have physical form. There were drawings of shapes that seemed to shift and change as you looked at them. Drawings of creatures that didn't seem to follow any biological logic. Drawings of landscapes that seemed to be inside-out versions of normal landscapes, with the sky beneath the ground and the earth above. On the floor of the bedroom, there was a circle drawn in white paint. Inside the circle were various symbols and markings. At the center of the circle was a note. The note read, "If you are reading this, then I have gone through. I have finally found the door. I have finally found the place where I can be all of me. I am sorry for calling. I needed someone to know. I needed someone to hear me. I needed someone to acknowledge that I existed before I ceased to exist. Thank you for listening, Margaret," but there was nobody. No sign of Margaret Hollis anywhere in the house. The officers searched every room. They checked closets, under beds, in the attic, in the basement. There was no Margaret. There was no indication of where she had gone or what had happened to her. It was as if she had simply vanished, leaving behind only her writings and her drawings and her cryptic final note. The police conducted an extensive search of the property. They brought in dogs. They dug up the yard looking for a grave. They searched the nearby woods. They interviewed neighbors. No one had seen Margaret Hollis in months. No one could provide any information about her. Bank records showed no recent transactions. Her phone had not been used in weeks. It was as if Margaret Hollis had dropped completely off the grid. Who was Margaret Hollis? Investigators began to piece together who Margaret Hollis was. They interviewed her family, her friends, and people who had known her. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had been normal and functional for most of her life, but who had undergone a dramatic transformation in the years before her disappearance. Margaret was a retired teacher. She had taught elementary school for 40 years. She had been well liked by her students and respected by her colleagues. She had never been married and had no children. She had lived alone for most of her adult life. She was known as a quiet, reserved person who was private about her personal life. She didn't go out much. She kept to herself. She spent most of her time reading or gardening or spending time in her house. About 5 years before her disappearance, neighbors noticed a change in Margaret. She became increasingly reclusive. She stopped going to her monthly book club. She stopped attending church. She rarely left the house. When neighbors would see her, she seemed distracted and confused. She would sometimes stand in her yard for hours, staring at nothing. She would mutter to herself. She seemed to be aging rapidly, as if something was eating away at her from the inside. Family members noted similar changes. Margaret became paranoid. She told her sister that there were people in her house who only she could see. She said that her walls were alive and that they were trying to communicate with her. She said that she was developing the ability to see into other dimensions. She claimed that she could hear voices from the future and from the past simultaneously. She said that she was becoming unstable. The different parts of herself were separating and fragmenting, and that she was gradually ceasing to exist as a unified person. Margaret's family urged her to see a doctor to get psychiatric help, but Margaret refused. She said that she wasn't sick, that she was experiencing something real, that she was undergoing a transformation that doctors would never understand. She said that she was becoming aware of truths about the nature of reality that most people would never comprehend. She said that once she fully understood these truths, she would cease to exist as she was and would become something else entirely. Records indicate that Margaret had several psychiatric evaluations, but she was never hospitalized. She showed no signs of immediate danger to herself or others. She was coherent enough during interviews to convince evaluators that she was simply eccentric and reclusive rather than truly mentally ill. She was living alone and not hurting anyone, so there was no legal basis for forced commitment. She was left to her own devices, left to descend further into whatever psychological state she was experiencing. About a year before her disappearance, Margaret hired someone to paint her entire house, inside and out. She specifically requested that the painter leave all the walls in the interior untouched. She wanted white walls, she said. That would be a canvas for her thoughts. After the painter finished, Margaret began the process of covering those walls with her writings and her drawings. This continued for approximately 1 year before her disappearance. The investigation, the disappearance of Margaret Hollis, and the mysterious 911 call were now being treated as a missing person case with potential foul play. Detectives from the Major Crimes Unit were assigned to investigate. They listened to the recording of the 911 call repeatedly, trying to extract any useful information. They analyzed the voice on the call. The distorted quality made it difficult to determine if it was actually Margaret's voice or if it was someone else entirely. Audio experts examined the call. They concluded that it was probably Margaret's voice, but heavily processed or distorted through some electronic means. The writings on the walls of her house were photographed and analyzed. Experts in psychology and linguistics were brought in to attempt to interpret what Margaret had written. Some of what she wrote appeared to be attempts to describe psychological states: dissociation, cord personalization, the fragmentation of identity. Some of it appeared to be attempts to describe physical sensations or perceptions that didn't correspond to physical reality. Some of it appeared to be completely nonsensical, the writings of someone whose mind had become completely detached from consensus reality. One particularly interesting discovery was made when investigators analyzed the sequence of the writings. The writings on the walls seemed to follow a chronological pattern, moving through the house from room to room in a way that suggested Margaret had been adding to them over time. The earliest writings appeared to be relatively coherent, with clear grammar and logical structure. As you moved through the house, the writings became increasingly incoherent, increasingly fragmented, increasingly difficult to interpret. The final writings on the walls of the bedroom where the circle was drawn were almost completely incomprehensible. Investigators tried to trace Margaret's activities in the weeks and days leading up to her disappearance. They obtained her credit card records, her bank statements, her phone records. There was almost no activity. She had stopped using her credit cards. She had stopped going to the grocery store. She had stopped driving. In the final weeks, it appeared that she had completely withdrawn from all normal activities and had remained exclusively in her house. Investigators interviewed the neighbors again. One neighbor, an elderly man named Robert Travis, reported something interesting. He said that in the final days before Margaret's disappearance, he had heard strange sounds coming from her house. He described hearing what sounded like chanting or rhythmic vocalizations late at night. He said that it went on for several hours. He had wanted to call the police but wasn't sure if it was his place to interfere. By the time he decided to call, the sounds had stopped. Investigators searched the house more thoroughly, looking for any clue about where Margaret might have gone or what might have happened to her. They found a journal in a desk drawer. The journal contained Margaret's personal writings, separate from the writings on the walls. The journal documented her psychological deterioration over the years. The earliest entries showed a woman struggling with existential questions. The middle entries showed increasing confusion and detachment from reality. The final entries were almost completely illegible, filled with symbols and fragments of words. The very last entry, dated 3 days before her disappearance, read, "Tomorrow is today. Yesterday is forever. I am finally ready. I am finally going to step through. I am finally going to find my way home to the place I came from, the place that exists in the spaces between." Theories and speculation as news of Margaret's disappearance and the mysterious 911 call spread, various theories began to circulate. Some people speculated that Margaret had simply left her house and gone somewhere, but where? Her car was still in her garage. She had no money with her. She had no family or friends to stay with. She had no history of travel or wanderlust. It seemed unlikely that she had voluntarily left on some kind of journey. Other people speculated that Margaret had died in the house, and that her body had somehow been disposed of or hidden. But an exhaustive search of the property, including ground-penetrating radar, had revealed nothing. If a body had been buried on the property, it would likely have been detected. If a body had been disposed of in some other way, there should have been evidence. Bloodstains, bodily fluids, something. But there was nothing. Some people speculated that Margaret had been murdered, that someone had killed her and disposed of her body. But who? There was no evidence of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no evidence of violence in the house. There was no suspect. There was no motive. It seemed unlikely that someone had killed Margaret. Some people speculated that Margaret had committed suicide, that she had died by some means that didn't leave a body. But how? There were no medications in lethal quantities in the house. There were no means of strangulation or asphyxiation. There was no note indicating suicidal ideation beyond the cryptic final note about stepping through. It seemed unlikely that Margaret had died by suicide. Some people, drawing on the strange nature of the 911 call and the bizarre writings on the walls, speculated that Margaret had experienced a complete psychotic break and had become so detached from reality that she had lost the ability to function. Maybe she had wandered away from her house in a confused state and had succumbed to the elements. Maybe she was still out there, wandering the woods or the streets, completely disconnected from reality. But search efforts to locate her turned up nothing. And then there were the more fringe theories. Some people speculated that Margaret's writings and her 911 call were evidence of contact with something otherworldly, something from beyond our normal perception of reality. Some people suggested that Margaret had actually succeeded in finding whatever door or threshold she was seeking and had somehow crossed over to another dimension or another plane of existence. These theories were dismissed by law enforcement and by mainstream investigators, but they persisted in the public consciousness, especially as the case remained unsolved. The recordings, the 911 call recording, became a subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. Amateur investigators and audio experts analyzed the recording obsessively, trying to extract hidden meanings from the distorted voice. Some people claimed that there were backward messages embedded in the call, hidden instructions or warnings that only became clear when the audio was reversed. Others claimed that certain frequencies in the recording corresponded to specific coordinates or to information about Margaret's location. One particularly popular theory suggested that the distorted voice wasn't Margaret at all, but rather two separate voices, Margaret's voice and another voice, something that wasn't human, that had somehow taken control of Margaret's body or was communicating through Margaret against her will. The theory suggested that the two-part harmony quality of the voice was evidence of two entities speaking simultaneously. This theory has no basis in evidence or in logic, but it captured people's imaginations and spread widely through internet forums and conspiracy websites. Some people tried to contact the 911 dispatcher, Susan Martin, and asked her directly about what she had heard. Susan initially cooperated with some amateur investigators, but as the conspiracy theories became more elaborate and more absurd, she withdrew from public engagement. She did give several interviews to true crime podcasts and documentaries in which she described her experience in detail. She said, "I don't know what that call was. I don't know who I was talking to. I don't know if it was Margaret or someone else. I wouldn't know if she was mentally ill or if she was experiencing something that I simply do and have the framework to understand. All I know is that after listening to that voice for 42 minutes, I couldn't look at the world the same way. It made me question whether I truly understand the nature of reality. It made me question whether there are things existing just outside the range of our normal perception. I don't believe in ghosts or aliens or interdimensional beings, but I also can't completely dismiss the possibility that there are things we don't understand." The official investigation into Margaret's disappearance eventually reached a dead end. There was simply not enough evidence to determine what had happened. The case was officially classified as inconclusive and was eventually transferred to the Cold Case Division. It remains unsolved decades later. Every few years there's a renewed interest in the case. Some new theory emerges. Some amateur investigator claims to have figured it out. But none of these theories ever leads anywhere productive. Alternative explanations from a psychological and medical perspective, what happened to Margaret Hollis, can be understood in several ways. The most likely explanation is that Margaret experienced a severe psychiatric break, probably in the form of schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. Schizophrenia often manifests in ways that are deeply disturbing to witnesses. The person experiences hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking. They lose the ability to distinguish between what is real and what is imaginary. They experience voices that aren't there. They develop beliefs that don't correspond to reality. The progression shown in Margaret's writings from relatively coherent expression to increasingly fragmented. An incoherent expression is consistent with the progression of an untreated psychotic disorder. The 911 call could be understood as Margaret's attempt to reach out for help while she was in the midst of a psychotic episode. The distorted quality of her voice could be explained by the fact that during severe psychosis, people often lose control of their physical body. They might speak in unusual ways or produce sounds that seem inhuman. The two-part harmony quality could simply be an artifact of the phone line or of the recording equipment. The content of what she was saying, the descriptions of impossible things. The fragmented thinking would be consistent with what someone in a severe psychotic state might say. As for Margaret's disappearance, the most likely explanation is that she left her house at some point after making the 911 call. Perhaps she was attempting to act on what she had described in the call. To go to a place where the trees forget to grow or to walk into the walls. Perhaps she was so detached from reality that she wandered away from her house and became lost or injured or fell prey to the elements. Perhaps she encountered someone and something tragic occurred, or perhaps she deliberately went somewhere to die, either by exposure or by some other means. and her body hasn't yet been found. The writings on her walls could be understood as her documentation of her mental state, her attempt to externalize the chaos that was occurring in her mind. The circle on the floor with the symbols could be understood as a ritualistic element that often accompanies severe psychosis. The note about stepping through could be understood as a reference to either suicide or to a psychotic delusion about transitioning to another state of being. We're making educated guesses based on psychological and medical knowledge. But it's far more likely that what happened to Margaret was the result of mental illness, rather than the result of supernatural or otherworldly phenomena. The problem is that without a body, without definitive evidence, we can never be completely certain. And that uncertainty is what keeps people fascinated by the case. The impact and legacy, the case of Margaret Hollis and the mysterious 911 call had a significant impact on the community where it occurred. It raised questions about how we treat mental illness, about how we balance individual privacy and autonomy with the need to help people who are in crisis. Margaret had been showing increasingly clear signs of serious mental illness. But because she wasn't an immediate threat to herself or others, and because she was competent enough to refuse psychiatric help, the system had been unable to intervene. By the time it became apparent that she was in serious danger, she had already disappeared. The case also had an impact on the 911 dispatcher, Susan Martin. She continued to work as a dispatcher for several more years after the call. But the experience of listening to Margaret's voice for 42 minutes had deeply affected her. She eventually left the job to pursue a career in mental health advocacy. She has worked extensively with organizations dedicated to improving mental health services and reducing the stigma associated with mental illness. In interviews, she has spoken about how the Margaret Hollis case changed her perspective on the world and motivated her. To try to help people struggling with mental health issues, the case became a fixture of true crime culture. It was featured in documentaries, podcasts, and books about mysterious disappearances. It spawned countless theories and conspiracy theories. It became the subject of creepypasta stories and internet horror fiction. Some people have made pilgrimage to the house where Margaret disappeared, trying to solve the mystery for themselves. The house has been sold several times since Margaret's disappearance, and each new owner has had to deal with the reputation of the house and the occasional curious visitor or amateur investigator showing up at their door. What we can learn the case of Margaret Hollis and the mysterious 911 call teaches us several important lessons. First, it teaches us about the importance of taking mental health crises seriously. Margaret showed increasing signs of mental illness over several years. She had psychiatric evaluations, she was clearly suffering. But the system was unable or unwilling to intervene in a meaningful way until it was too late. We need better systems in place to help people who are in psychological crisis, even when they don't want help, even when they are technically competent to refuse treatment. We need to balance autonomy with compassion and the need to protect vulnerable people. Second, the case teaches us about how disconnected from reality someone can become while still maintaining the appearance of functionality. Margaret was living alone in her house, paying her bills, maintaining her property. From the outside, she appeared to be functioning, but internally her grasp on reality had become completely severed. This is something that can happen to anyone, in anyone. Mental illness doesn't discriminate. It can affect anyone at any time, regardless of their education, their intelligence, or their social status. Third, the case teaches us about the limitations of investigation and the frustration of uncertainty. We don't know what happened to Margaret Hollis. We can make educated guesses, can apply our understanding of psychology and psychiatry to try to interpret what happened, but we can never be completely certain. This is a reality of missing person cases. Many people disappear, and we never find out what happened to them. Many cases remain unsolved forever. We have to learn to accept this uncertainty, even though it's deeply frustrating. Fourth, the case teaches us about the power of mystery and how it can capture our collective imagination. The mysterious 911 call, the bizarre writings on the walls, the cryptic final note. The unexplained disappearance, all of these elements combine to create a story that is deeply compelling, deeply unsettling, and deeply mysterious. This combination of elements is what draws people in. What keeps them speculating? What keeps the case alive in the public consciousness decades after it occurred? But we need to be careful about how we engage with mystery, about how much credence we give to unsubstantiated theories. about how we balance the desire for explanation with the acceptance of uncertainty. The closure that never came. Margaret Hollis was declared legally dead by a judge in 2011. 8 years after her disappearance, her family received a small inheritance from her estate. But the lack of a body, the lack of evidence about what had happened, meant that there was no real closure. There was no funeral where people could gather and remember her and say goodbye. There was no answer to the fundamental question of what had happened to her. There was only the mystery. Her house still stands in the neighborhood, now owned by someone else. The writings on the walls have been painted over. The circle on the bedroom floor has been covered. Any evidence of Margaret's final days has been erased, but the mystery remains. The 911 recording remains. The stories remain. The speculation remains. Margaret Hollis has become a ghost story, a puzzle with no solution, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the reality of how easily someone can disappear from our world. Final thoughts: the case of Margaret Hollis and the most mysterious. 911 call ever made reminds us that there are things in this world that we do unfully understand. It reminds us that the human mind is capable of descending into states that seem almost incomprehensible to those observing from the outside. It reminds us that there are people suffering in isolation, people struggling with demons that nobody else can see, people who need help but don't know how to ask for it. It reminds us that our systems are often inadequate to help people in crisis. It reminds us that closure and answers aren't always available, even when we desperately need them. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, please reach out for help. The National Alliance on Mental Illness has a helpline available at 1-800-950-NAMI, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available at 988. Crisis Text line is available by texting HOME to 741,741. These services are free, confidential, and available 24 hours a day. Getting help is not weakness, it's strength. It's taking responsibility for your own well-being and for your own life. The mystery of Margaret Hollis remains unsolved. The question of what happened to her that night remains unanswered. The 911 call remains a testament to her suffering and to the failure of systems that were supposed to help her. But perhaps her story can serve a greater purpose. Perhaps it can remind us of the importance of taking mental health seriously, of treating people with compassion even when they are difficult to understand, of creating systems that actually help people in crisis, rather than just documenting their suffering. Thank you for watching. I encourage you to share this video with others. I encourage you to think about what you would do if someone you knew was showing the kind of warning signs that Margaret showed. I encourage you to reach out to people who are struggling. I encourage you to break the stigma around mental illness. And I encourage you to remember Margaret Hollis, not as a mysterious victim of an unsolved case, but as a human being who was suffering and who deserved better. Thank you.